Okay, now we're going to look at chapter 5. Children, yes or no? Now I know it sounds kind of like, well, do you have them or don't? It's kind of like a black and white. But we're going to look at it in terms of how things have been changing over time. And children, for the most part, within a family is considered a significant marker about having a family, that otherwise you're just a couple. And we looked at that in the last chapter around people who choose to be married without children. But in our society, we still view it as a very significant marker about being married and having a family. In the past, couples have been relatively limited by their choice. Either you had children or you didn't. But what we're noticing in terms of the shifts of time, and we've had so many other different areas because of the development of contraception and legal and easy ways of doing contraception, whereas in the past it wasn't an option, neither was it legal to do some of the options that we have today. The availability of abortion, prenatal diagnosis, amniocentesis, being able to determine what the baby's sex is, physical characteristics and physical condition is before the child's birth. Technology assisted conception. Now this has been something that's been around for maybe longer than you think. We'll look at in vitro fertilization back in 1989, the first person who was born in a test tube. We'll look at artificial insemination, surrogates, hosts, and a variety of options, many more options in terms of what technology is being able to consider, or at least give us as options. And then we'll also have to consider then would be, well, because we can, should we? And if we do, under what circumstances? And when should we and when shouldn't we? So we'll look at some of the ethical issues. All right, I hope you enjoy this chapter.
Okay, you're seeing here is a chart. You'll find this in your textbook as well. And there are various reasons, both personal and social, for having children. Having a child results in a change in status in society, and it's one of the reasons that we get married is so we can have children. Not that you can't have children outside of marriage, but it is one of the things that we tend to do when we get into together. It's a result of changing our status. It's also a marker event. We celebrate having a baby. Maybe you've had a shower, or maybe you've given out cigars. Not that that's a current strategy of doing that anymore, but it is something that we sort of mark off that, hey, look at what I've done, look what we're doing, hey, isn't this a cute little baby, and aren't we, we're getting excited. We rearrange our house and stuff like that. Over the past 50 years, a significant drop in Canadian fertility rate. In 1959, the fertility rate, which is the rate in which women of childbearing years produce children, in 1959, 3.93, almost 4 children per woman. In 2000, it's down to 1.49, 1.5. No, you don't actually get a half, but it just sort of shows statistically 1.5 children per woman. And in 2009, 1.7. So we appear to be having a bit of an increase. I think that the population currently is, if we want to maintain the population distribution as is, women today need to have 2.1 children to maintain. And so as it turns out, we're not, and we haven't for some time now. At some point in their lives, nearly all Canadians will consider having children. And this table that you're seeing here shows that only 7% of Canadian women do not intend to have children at all. Now, this issue of children, yes or no, enters into a dialogue when we look at the social script. And a social script, well, it's basically what does society say that should be the way things should be, given being male or female, and other social issues. There's a great deal of social pressure still to have children, and follow that's being the social script, is that at some point many women will probably hear from somebody they know, family member or relation, so when are you going to have kids? It's part of the social script. And there is within this script this sort of expectation that women should have children because it will be the most important, most fulfilling way that a woman can experience in her life, and the only thing that will take as high a priority in her life. And it's called the myth of motherhood. And there's been a lot of research on it and a lot of books written about it. Another part of the myth is this importance of having a child of each sex, that without all four, the family is felt to be incomplete. When I say four, I mean a husband and wife and 2 children, 1 girl and 1 boy. Some unmarried women choose to have children without a long-term partner. So are they fulfilling the myth of motherhood, or is this myth of motherhood really no longer a valid script anymore? Now, what I want to touch base with now is looking at the sociological perspective. Now, you notice what I put here is sunglasses, and I've done that for a purpose. If you would imagine each of the theories is like wearing a different set of sunglasses looking at families in Canada. They'll all see the same number of families, but what they'll see is each with a slightly different view. So each of these theorists looking at family don't entirely see families differently. They just explain the role of families and the influence of families on society with a slightly different perspective. So the structural functionalists, if you remember what's going on here, is the focus is on having children as being a necessary function of families. That it's what keeps society going, insofar as it keeps members there. And part of what having kids in the responsibility from a functionalist perspective includes is being there to emotionally support them, to be able to financially support them, to psychologically support them, teach them the way of the world, and to be good quality citizens of a particular society that they live in. Now, from a developmental approach, they see having children as a part of a developmental task, part of what stages, that families go through. We start out as children, we go through our teens lives, we begin to look for someone who we could settle down with, we find somebody, we get married or have some sort of a family relation, we start to have kids, and then those kids, as they grow up, create developmental tasks that we as parents experience as they grow up. Conflict theorists, they suggest the social pressure to have children reflects prevailing ideology. That is to say, how families with children have greater social advantages than those without. Now, the systems theory, they look at how decisions to have children create different subsystems that affect family dynamics. That when you have one child, it affects the whole family, the mom and the dad and the child, and how they have to reorganize how and what they do. And then when you have a second child, all 3 previous members have to reorganize and set up and how they're going to negotiate and work with one another. Do we share a room for the 2 kids? Do we have a room on their own? So all these other sort of decisions become part of these subsystems that affect family dynamics. The ecological approach looks at how wider social context influences decisions to have children, also determines experiences of families with children. So it's looking at what other social influences outside of the family influence families having more or less children. Symbolic interactionalists are focusing on those personal reasons for having or not having children. What influences you to say, well, I will have children, but I'm going to have them later in life, or I'm not going to have children because. So it's looking at the individual components about what makes us feel the way we do about having children or not having children. And feminist theories tend to study the childbearing as an issue reflecting women's control over reproduction. They look and see, remember, they're looking at the world very much from this is a patriarchal world, a male-driven world, and having children is a part of that world. Feminists look at the childbearing as an issue reflecting women should be able to control their own reproductive system. Now, what you're going to see next here is the total fertility rate in Canada chart. Now, although there is pressure on couples to have children, it's almost as strong as ever, and the size of Canadian families have been shrinking. In order to replace the population, each woman must have 2.1 children. Canada has been below this level since 1977. The total fertility rate is the average number of births per woman over the course of her reproductive life. And in Canada, it's been fairly stable since 1966 at about 1.6 children per childbearing woman. Now, another term you should be familiar with is called crude birth rate. This is the number of births per population. Dropped during the Great Depression The baby boom from 1946 to 1964 saw a dramatic increase in the number of children. And you can see that in the chart there. From one generation to the next, a decrease in fertility at the youngest ages has an increase among the older women. Postponing births into their 30s does not make up for the drop in fertility in their 20s. A number of approaches have increased the birth rate to replacement levels has been tried or suggested in the past. Family allowance program in Canada began in 1945, and this gave benefits for children under the age 16. So families would receive money for children under age 16. Theorists suggest that the increase in fertility depends on providing conditions to increase your young people's confidence in the future. Encouraging immigration of young people who are childbearing age will stimulate a sagging birth rate. And that's part of what Canada has done over the last 15 years. The issue of teenage pregnancy has always been interesting insofar as it's generally seen as a social problem requiring preventative efforts. Changes in teen pregnancy rates reflect more effective contraceptive use, general access to reproductive health services, higher quality sexual health education, and a shift in social norms. The rate of teenage pregnancy has been going down, not going up. Teenage pregnancy rate in Canada has declined each consecutive year since 1996 to 2006. In 1996, we had 42.2 teenage pregnancies per 100 women, ages 15 to 19. In 2006, that number went down to 27.9. Many teens who became pregnant chose abortion, and the Canadian teen birth rate has decreased from 22.1% to 13.7% in 2006. So it's been an improvement in a lot of education and a lot of contraceptive potential and changing in attitudes of younger people. So what explains this shrinking family? Well, we can look at a few things. We can look at medical advancements. Death of a child under the age of 1 in what's called infant mortality is down steadily since the 60s. Medicines, medical support technology has all contributed to improving child health and child success rates. Don't need large families to ensure the survival of 2 and 3, and that's historically what had happened. Medically, we weren't able to protect kids from things like measles and chickenpox and other sort of diseases that we just don't see anymore. So you'd have 5 or 6 kids knowing that 2 or 3 would die. Well, we don't have that anymore, and so family size has shrunk. Contraception, improvements in contraceptions, and they're more reliable. The pill it began in 1961. Tubal ligation, vasectomies, these are all things that we have done in a way of reducing the rate of fertility in terms of shrinking family. Now, the changes in laws have also had an impact. Changes in law in July of 1st, 1969, contraception became legal. Prior to that, contraception was illegal. The birth rate showed its sharpest drop following a legalization of birth control, and abortion was legalized in 1969. Now, economic trends, well, we could see that a shift in a resource-based economy, that is an economy that's based on using resources to manufacturing, has had a huge impact on Canadian birth rate. We also can recognize that child labor, more children were better and they were cheap labor back in the 1900s. Technology, manufacturing advances in children are seen as more of a liability. The Depression, well, there were smaller families. The economic boom post-World War II, well, larger families, and we had what was called the baby boom. Through the 70s and the 80s, more women were in the workforce, smaller families, children were expensive. Raising a child at to age 18 cost nearly $167,000 in 2004. And then, not to exclude, we have psychological reasons that the family is shrinking. The value of children, the VOC it's called, it's a framework which classifies and the 3 satisfactions or values of having children, and there's 3 that they reference there in your textbook. It's called instrumental assistance. This is where having kids helps us in our old age. Rewarding interaction, companionship and love, and psychological appreciation. Watching your children grow and be successful. There's also costs. The financial cost, the cost of education, the cost of raising a child, the cost of all the things associated with raising a child, child rearing demands. This is the emotional strain and the pregnancy and the restrictions on parents. That is to say, the being tied down, if you will, the cost of the social relationships and marital strain. And so the psychological effect can be pretty important for some people to not have as many kids and choose to have smaller families. So let's look at the different, some of the variations here. We can look at child-free by choice. Between 7 to 8% of the Canadian population chooses to remain childless, and there's lots of reasons for this. Some women fear giving up the equality they have established in a marital relationship, and if there are children who require care, it takes up more time and more energies. Some women do not wish to sacrifice a career to which they've really been dedicated to. So some couples want to keep their options open for new experiences, travel, hobbies, adventures, education. And in some cases, some do not have the partner with whom they want to have children. So despite the growing acceptance of family difference, those choosing not to have children face disadvantages. Outsiders may become intrusive, wanting to know why someone remains childless. Women who choose not to have children are often considered antisocial or psychologically defective. Couples marriages may be considered unsatisfying if they're perceived as being too selfish. And so there's strengths and weaknesses, but more couples have been moving towards being childless by choice. Now there are examples where there are unwanted children, and usually the woman has three options to deal with this. Some pregnancies of both single and married individuals are unwanted. A pregnant woman can choose abortion, adoption, or raising the child by herself. In the mid-70s, new choices available for unmarried pregnant women. They had medical, legal, and social changes that have brought about more choices to women today. Going through an adoption is legal rights and responsibilities are transferred from the birth parents to the adoptive parents. Moms who make this choice are offered various degrees of openness in the adoption, that is to say how much contact they can have with their child as the child grows up. Usually the decision to give up a child for adoption is extremely challenging, very painful for the birth mother. The foster homes are another sort of kind of relationship there, and that is more of a natural home, a substitute home with varying degrees of openness and visitation. Oftentimes they are more short-term than adoptions. Raising a child by yourself, raising the child by oneself, there's a stigma attached to those who don't raise their own biological children. Many children who are unplanned, initially unwanted, eventually become very much loved. Gay and lesbians have difficulties had difficulties adopting children. An unwanted child who was raised by a parent is at risk for physical and emotional abuse. And this is something I found that I thought was kind of an interesting little comic. Now, one of the ones that I hadn't talked about yet was abortion. So let's move to the next slide here. Abortion. This is a medical termination of a pregnancy. Now, in Canada, abortions have been legal under certain circumstances since 1969, and with no restrictions since 1988. Allowed throughout most of the 9-month pregnancy. Number of abortions have decreased slowly in recent years. Greater access to contraception results in fewer unwanted pregnancies and therefore fewer abortions. And the number of abortions in Canada has decreased slowly in recent years. And you can see that in the table in the top right-hand corner. History of abortion rights in Canada, you can find that on Table 1 on page 131, 132. Like other aspects of reproduction, abortion has raised many questions. When is a human life presumed to begin? Whose life is to have priority, a woman or a fetus? Does a woman have a right to control her own reproductive system? How late should an abortion be permitted? Um, there is a technique, and those of you in nursing will be familiar with amniocentesis, and this is where you're able to take samples of the amniotic fluid and determine the health of the baby. There's strengths and weaknesses to be doing this. For some, it was a way of what's called female feticide. And this is where it's a practice of aborting female fetuses. You do the amniocentesis, you find you're going to have a female, and in some cultures that was not acceptable, and they would commit what was called female feticide and kill the female fetus. It happens in India and in China by the millions historically. It's not in the same capacity as it once was. It's also happened in North America in numbers large enough to distort the male-female ratio in some ethnic groups. Infanticide, sorry, in the Canadian Criminal Code, this is where a female person commits infanticide when she causes the death of her own newly born child. This is rare in extreme cases, but it often occurs after mothers have tried to conceal the pregnancy. Now, unrelated to the bottom two components, I'm going to play a video that's a US-based one, but it's just an interesting component on this area of abortion. It's not me expressing a point of view. It's just that it was a part of what was in the book, our textbook. So I'm going to show it to you, and you can make your own decision about what you thought about it.
Most things in life aren't simple, and that includes abortion. It's personal. It can be complicated, and for many people, it's not a black and white issue. So why do people try to label it like it is? Pro-choice? Pro-life? The truth is, these labels limit the conversation and simply don't reflect how people actually feel about abortion. A majority of Americans believe abortion should remain safe and legal. Many just don't use the words pro-choice. They don't necessarily identify as pro-life either. Truth is, they just don't want to be labeled. What they want is for a woman to have access to safe and legal abortion if and when she needs it. But when it comes to abortion, who decides? Her congressman? Her governor? Her president? Women don't turn to politicians for advice about mammograms, prenatal care, or cancer treatments, and they shouldn't. Politicians don't belong in a woman's personal medical decisions about her pregnancy. When it comes down to it, we just don't know a woman's specific situation. We're not in her shoes. Ultimately, decisions about whether to choose adoption, end a pregnancy, or raise a child must be left to a woman, her family, and her faith, with the counsel of her doctor or healthcare provider. So the next time you talk about abortion, don't let the labels box you in. Have a different conversation, a conversation that doesn't divide you, but is based on mutual respect and empathy. To learn more, go to notinhershoes.org.
Okay, well, I hope that maybe shed a little light or give you some perspective. Now I'm going to go into a little more detail with foster care and adoption. Foster care, this is a provision of care by a family other than the parent or the guardian of the child, and it's approved and arranged by a child welfare authority of some sort. Trend in foster care is now away from baby care and long-term placements. Advances in medical science mean that Canadian children are unlikely to be orphaned with improvements in the benefits for single parents. Children are less likely to enter foster care because of extreme poverty. More likely, they'd be in foster care because of behavioral problems or as a victim of neglect or abuse. Now, adoption, unlike foster care, it's a legal transfer of parental rights and obligations from the birth parent to the adoptive parents. Once parental rights have been terminated, the biological parents cannot remain in custody. Now, there's open and closed adoptions. Open adoptions are a form of adoption where the adoptive parents and the birth parents know each other and exchange information. Whereas a closed adoption, the biological and adopted parents know little or nothing of each other. Records are often sealed, preventing the child from tracing his or her roots, preventing the birth parents from knowing what became of their child. Now, in Aboriginal culture, they have Aboriginal custom adoptions. This is a privately arranged adoption between two families within an Aboriginal community. The goal is to ensure Aboriginal children are raised in Aboriginal families to retain their language and cultural identities. Now you see in the bottom right hand corner there the term stigma. And there is stigma attached to those who do not raise their own biological children. The notion of adopting being second best makes some adoptive parents feel like they're not fully entitled to the child they are raising. Emphasis on blood ties and genetic heritage are also underlying in the recent flood of adoptees seeking contact with their birth parents. I think we would find in Canadian society that this stigma is maybe not as profound as it once was. And then the last little bit on this again are just adding a little more information on raising a child by oneself. The numbers about how many children in families are being raised by parents who don't want them. Well, it's almost impossible to know that number. With abortions, adoptions, foster care, they can count. But with unwanted children being raised by somebody, well, children in a family are assumed to be wanted, and maybe they're not. Married women do have abortions and do place their children with other families in spite of the stigma. Many unplanned children are well loved. Many unmarried mothers choose this. Does this help our awareness of unwanted children if an unmarried woman chooses to have a child? Both women and men raising children by themselves by choice. We have more examples of that. So it's kind of hard now to sort of determine where and when and how often does this occur. What is known is that unwanted children raised by parents is a risk for those children. Physical and emotional abuse potential, and many other risks to be discussed later in the semester. Now, let's say you are not able to have children. Well, you might be looking at a variety of ways. Now, new technology has really been a huge assistance. Now, some people are what's called involuntarily childless. They're infertile couples. They may have a sense of being defective in some capacity, and that's a shame, which reduces their overall sense of self-worth. Usually women feel the lack of children more than men do because of the social pressures, the psychological effects about, women should be having children. The medical investigation to go through using technical support is very intrusive, and it can be very uncomfortable. But many couples do go through that in order to have the opportunity to have their own children. So there's other options, of course, we've discussed. There's foster care, there's adoption, but reproductive technologies, these include artificial insemination, using women in particular as surrogates or host wombs, or using in vitro fertilization. Now, going through artificial insemination, this is the practice of using sperm from a donor and to fertilize an egg. The donor sperm is used when the husband is infertile or carries a genetic disorder, and it's also used when unmarried women who wish to have children. Now, the surrogate mothers and host wombs, this has gotten to be more complicated than it was intended when people started trying this out. A woman who agrees to artificial insemination, usually for a fee, with a view to turning over the resulting child to the biological father and his wife. And since 2004, surrogacy in Canada has been regulated by the Assisted Human Rights Act. And in Canada, the Assisted Human Reproductive Act, was introduced in 2004 to regulate this issue. And you'll see it in your textbook, box 5.3 on page 148. You might begin to wonder, do other countries adhere to the same regulations? Now, because of the international capacity to do this, and there's been lots of examples now where either the parents who have hired a surrogate to carry their baby to term have said, we don't want the baby anymore, we've changed our mind. And so now we have a surrogate mom who never intended to keep the child with the child now. And the other way around, surrogates who have decided later in the pregnancy, I'm sorry, I don't want to give up the baby anymore. So this has become more challenging and more difficult, and we see this occurring with single moms, single women who want children, and single dads who want children. And then in vitro fertilization is a technique of fertilizing a woman's egg with a partner's sperm in a lab dish. in a petri dish, just like what you see on the screen, the bottom left-hand corner. And later, placing the embryo into the uterus. The procedure usually used with fallopian tubes leading from the woman's ovaries are blocked. So in 1978, the first test tube baby was born in England. Her name was Louise Brown. That's her in the bottom right-hand corner as an adult with her own child. One cycle of in vitro fertilization can cost as much as anywhere between $7,500 and $1,200. With advances in DNA technology, possible to test embryo sex, inherited diseases, and quality of health. It brings us with a lot of moral issues and moral questions when you start delving into the potential to play around with genetics as it relates to having babies. So new technology brings about different issues. You know, who's the parent? Is it an intentional mother or father, genetic mother or father, gestational mother, nurturing mother? So we have a bunch of issues. Cost, it can be very costly. We can look at contracts, enforceability of these contracts. Are there laws in the countries where people are doing this that protect surrogates, sperm donors, any of the participants? What about consent? What if can someone take and use our eggs or our sperm to produce a child for themselves? Don't we have to consent? We've had examples of people who have removed sperm or eggs from loved ones who have passed away in order to continue on and have a baby with that loved one's eggs or sperm. Is that something we should be able to do? And is it something we shouldn't do? Who's the parent? In that situation where you remove the sperm from a recently passed away spouse and you give that sperm to somebody else who then has a child, who's the parents? Selection has got to do with designer babies. You can, with the technology in place now, make some selections about what kinds of traits and capabilities do you want the child to have. So we have a number of these ethical and moral dilemmas. As the technology advances, moral and ethical questions arise. Is it right to allow better off people to have children and deny them to the poor because they can afford it? Will women with lower incomes become the providers rather than the recipients of such services? Reports that clinics in developing countries provide surrogacy services at lower costs. Do surrogate mothers truly understand what they are agreeing to? Is it legal to use sperm and eggs taken from a comatose or dead individual? How long should frozen embryos be kept? What should be done with embryos if the prospective parents both die? What happens if the couple divorce and one ex-partner no longer wishes to have a child? Should in vitro fertilization be available to women over 55? Should prospective parents be tested to determine whether they are qualified to raise a child? The ethical and moral issues are huge, and so what we have with this Assisted Human Reproductive Act is it's not just looking at, anymore at least, surrogacy, but looking at human cloning, gene line therapy, substituting healthy genes for unhealthy genes to prevent a disorder or to pass on healthy genes. It's starting to have to be much more complex because of how technology has really grown to help and assist families who want to have children. Okay, there we go. Children, yes or no, Chapter 5. I hope this was helpful, and good luck on the rest of the semester.